Hi guys, and welcome to another Wisdom Wednesday topic. Bit of a different angle from this one, but my recent guilty pleasure is SAS Who Dares Wins. And in today's presentation, I'm going to be outlining how strength and conditioning can help you if that is something that you are preparing to do. Now, whenever I watch the program, I think to myself, what would my physical approach be to training for something like this? So I really hope that in this presentation I can outline some key principles, provide some example sessions that I think would be beneficial for somebody looking to go onto the show or somebody from a military background. Now, I'll explain a little bit about my background in a second, but keen to stress that I am obviously not from a military background, so if this falls into the hands of people who are, very keen to hear your thoughts, your critique, and any feedback you have based on this episode. I'm going to be talking about the spectrum of specificity as it applies to training for SAS, and I think this is going to be incredibly useful for other sports because for me specificity is one of the most poorly applied and misunderstood principles when it comes to strength and conditioning. I'm also going to talk about something which could relate to any sport, and that is how you layer in what physical qualities you're training at what time in relation to your competition event. Get this right and they will sequentially build on each other. Get this wrong and you'll build a quality only to find that it's disappeared in time for your big event. Finally, I'm going to wrap up with lessons that I've certainly learned from the program, or things that have been thinking about based on what I've seen, and they're not all physical. So let's get into it. So my background, as I said, not from a military background. My strength and conditioning background, undergrad, masters, been lucky enough to work with Olympic and Paralympic sports from GB boxing to GB table tennis. First learned to lift and learn everything that's kick-started my strength and conditioning journey by some excellent coaches as part of a Sport 981 internship at Durham University. Been lucky enough to coach youth level with 2 years at an all-girls school, leading the S&C program there, and worked abroad with a German lacrosse team, as well as publishing my dissertation on change of direction performance in elite cricket. So I'd like to think that I've been there and done it to a certain extent from a coaching and experience perspective, but always trying to find out more. So again, excited to hear what other coaches, athletes, and any other military personnel who are watching this think of my thoughts on the topic. Now, how would I train for it? This got me thinking, and I've come to the conclusion I'd probably use I take influence from 3 different sports. Now, firstly, I would take from powerlifting, but I would say the key is to be strong enough. Now, this sounds like a bit of a weird concept, but the reality is you probably need strength in the military to be able to haul your own body weight across certain terrain, and worst case scenario, haul someone else's body weight and whatever baggage or whatever the technical term is that you've got to lug across a battlefield. So you need to be strong enough. Interestingly, in the SAS Who Dares Wins latest episode that I've watched, one of the girls talks about having a 170 deadlift, and the chap who she had to basically have a little bit of a boxing match against had a deadlift of 160. Now, needless to say, he overpowered her a little bit, but she's incredibly freaking strong. What I'm trying to say is that strength is almost your key in the door, or your sort of entrance to the club, as it were, in terms of the queue, but it doesn't guarantee that you're coming out as a winner. So you need to be strong enough. Now, another sport I would take inspiration from is strongman. Now, the reason I say that is because if I went into SAS Who Dares Wins, as I've said, I've loosely thought about, from a strength perspective, I think I'd do all right given my powerlifting background, but the difference in the way you apply force in something like SAS or the military is you are dealing with awkward loads, which are also somewhat heavy as well. This is why I'd take inspiration from strongman, because not only are they strong, but it's a strength endurance task. You need to be strong enough, but you're applying strength over a slightly more prolonged time period than simply a 1 rep max in powerlifting. And finally, potentially slightly controversial given my views on CrossFit, but that's for a different day, I would also take inspiration from CrossFit. The reason being that in CrossFit, you never know exactly what the session's going to be. So if you look at elite CrossFit anyway, they're all pretty darn strong, they're all pretty darn powerful, and they all have a wide base of movement skills in their toolbox. So as you get closer towards SAS trials, if that's even a thing, that's when I would start looking at mixing up the modalities of your conditioning, mixing up your strength work and making it look a little bit more specific to the actual event in mind. So as I said, it's important for us to be strong, because if we're strong, we're pulling up all the sub-maximal qualities underneath it. However, we can't make the mistake of being only strong. Case in point, I think my 8 rep max or 10 rep max, whatever, would probably be better than most people's, but in CrossFit, their 8 rep max and their ability to repeat, for example, strength over a longer duration of time is going to be better than mine, because I simply don't train in that way. So this is stolen or adapted from throws coach Anatoly Bondarchuk. Now, he was one of the most successful Olympic coaches ever in terms of medals won, and this is how he broke down the exercise hierarchy. So on one end of the spectrum, you've got your competitive exercise. This is what competition actually looks like. So for example, in the case of powerlifting, it's 1RM, squat, bench and deadlift. And in the case of SAS, obviously it's hard to define exactly what you'll come up against, but it will probably involve lifting heavy loads for long durations of time, probably involve some element of aerobic activity whilst you're moving, and as I said, the loads are going to be pretty awkward. On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have general physical preparation, which might not look like anything that you will see in the actual sport, and in between it you have varying degrees of stuff that is more or less towards the general end of the spectrum. Now, to flesh this out a bit, I've provided an example in the following slide, so we'll get into that now. So this for me is what the SAS Specificity Continuum would look like in relation to the actual tasks involved. So for example, on one end of the spectrum, we have general physical preparation. As I said, doesn't really look exactly like what you'd encounter in the competitive event, and specifically applied to the SAS. Here we're looking at evenly distributed loads. So for example, 70 kilos on a barbell is going to feel a lot different to 70 kilos in the form of another human being. Now, during this phase, I would look to develop qualities in their own individual rights. So for example, I'd be looking to build a base of strength. I'd probably introduce speed, although I've put a question mark because I'm keen to hear other people's thoughts. The reason being that for me, if you're in a fight or flight situation, you want to be able to basically put your pedal to the metal and get the hell out of there. And of course, more importantly, which I'll definitely focus on, is aerobic capacity. So just being generally fit, for want of a better word. As we move down the specificity spectrum, now we're looking at slightly more asymmetrically distributed loads. So for example, one side might be having to do more work than the other. So for example, we're still training in relatively stable environments, but it's not quite as stable as a barbell. Equally, we're looking at types of training that allow for the greatest overload. So for example, I wouldn't be too fussed if someone going for the SAS was still using, say, cycling or rowing at this stage, if that allowed the greatest overload of the cardiovascular system. I'm not too fussed about how specific it is in relation to how it looks. What I'm concerned about how specific it is does it allow you to specifically overload that system? And now I might even start to combine modalities. So for example, I might be training in a strength endurance rep range. So the reps have come slightly higher to see if I can express that force over a longer time duration. And equally, as I said, speed endurance. Once we've worked on expressing speed over short distances, where we're using the ATP PC energy system, and if you want to learn more about that, then you can look at my aerobic versus anaerobic video in boxing. And finally, as in the last two elements, we're looking at awkward loads such as sandbags. We might combine modalities, so this is looking at our ability to, for example, perform loaded carries and combine this with our conditioning, so for example, our running and groundwork. And finally, we have our specific physical preparation, otherwise known as the competitive exercise itself. So this is where we're looking at awkward loads, so for example, other people. We're looking at, for example, can we combine modalities, so swimming, running, carrying heavy loads? How well do we recover in between that? So here's what it might look like in terms of squats, carries, and for example, an explosive exercise. So the most general would be back squat because it's an evenly distributed load and we're in a stable environment. Front squat, again, still evenly distributed, but one of the aspects that you have more so in a front squat than a back squat is because of the placement of the bar, you have to be able to breathe, brace, and do this effectively. Obviously, still need to brace in a back squat, but when the bar is against your throat, this obviously changes things slightly. Then going to something like a Zercher squat, we're looking at challenging that postural stability and seeing if we can resist our spine basically flexing with the load on the front. And finally, looking at something like a double kettlebell front squat. So yes, the loads used will be lighter, but because of where the load sits in relation to the body, this is going to develop what Dan John calls anaconda strength. So basically the ability to still continue a strength exercise whilst effectively developing strength of the trunk and postural muscles. Finally, I'd look at something like a fireman squat. I'm sure there's probably a technical name for this, but this would be, for example, physically squatting with someone in a fireman carry position. And looking at the loaded carries, so something like a yoke walk, you're going to get the maximum overload because you're going to get the maximum weight on the bar because it's still fairly evenly distributed because of the nature of the equipment. Then we might look at challenging grip strengths through something like a farmer's walk. Again, because of the load placement of the bar has changed from our back to our hands, this is going to stress grip strength even more. And then we start looking at more awkward objects, so sandbag carries. You can't fully get a grip on it, just like trying to drag another human being is difficult because they're not exactly as evenly loaded as a barbell or performing a yoke walk. Obviously, fireman's carries are slightly more difficult because, as I just said, a human isn't exactly an evenly distributed object. And finally, a Zercher carry, because God forbid you had to carry someone who had lost the use of their limbs, then you're probably not going to be throwing them on your back as easily as you think. And finally, with the power exercises, so a power clean and push press, again, in an ideal world, an athlete has, or SAS person has effective technique with this, and then using variations such as a log clean and press. As I said, the loads are becoming slightly more awkward, and finishing with something as awkward and that you can't grip onto like a sandbag clean and press. So it's going to develop strong shoulders, strong legs, and ultimately the ability to brace and resist external forces. Now, if we go into phase one of the concepts I've spoken about, so the key themes here, we're looking to build a reserve of whole body strength. So for example, by using movements such as the deadlift and the back squat, we are building maximal strength. Now, the reason why this is important is because the stronger you are, the lighter a given load is going to appear. So for example, if I've got a back squat of say 180, which I do, thank you very much, then obviously carrying another human on my back who weighs say 80 kilos is going to feel much lighter in comparison to somebody who can only back squat say 70. And so as I said, whole body strength is important in our general physical preparation phase, because by increasing our absolute strength, our relative strength should come up along with this as well. You'll also notice that there's a high-low system in place in terms of this weekly schedule. So what I mean is, for example, Monday is pretty taxing on the nervous system because we're sprinting at maximum intensity. Tuesday, we're looking at lower intensity aerobic work. So rucking, if you've not heard of it, is an idea I've stolen from Dan John. Basically, you put a heavy backpack on, or if you so chose to, you could just fill it with sand, or just basically carry a weighted vest on you, and you walk for a given time frame. So this is obviously conditioning our military athlete to be accustomed to basically carrying load on them. It's going to increase the heart rate, but it's not going to do it in the same way that, for example, sprints would. Now, looking at Wednesday sessions, so barbell complexes are included just to, one, go through some simple movements back to back, and two, because it can build a little bit of capacity and sort of disguise a little bit of conditioning work in there. The yoke walk allows us to maximally overload how much weight we can carry. The prowler sprints, as I said, they're in there because the time duration means we're not going to have a heavy amount of soreness, and because there's no eccentric load on a prowler, that basically means there's no lowering phase. We are probably not going to get as sore from this as we would do if, for example, we just went running and there was a downward phase involved, for example running down a hill or something like that. We've also stressed hip and shoulder strength through the deadlift, the overhead press and the chin-ups. I've included technical swimming, again for someone who's in reasonable condition, who can swim relatively okay. That's probably going to feel like more of a recovery day. So, and then finally we have Sunday off. Moving into phase 2, we're looking to maintain strength, and I put that in quotation marks because we're going to almost want to improve strength just so that as we get more tired from the condition work increases, we're going to almost get stronger to have to stand still. This is known as the strength paradox. Repeated speed work is now in there, so the volume of sprinting is heavier, there's more of it. We've got incomplete rest between sprints, but still a reasonable amount. So we're going to get a carryover effect to our aerobic system as well. We're also increasing the maximal overload on the heart and lungs because we're asking them to pump oxygenated blood as hard and fast as possible to the working muscles. Fartlek training is another thing which is looking slightly more specific to the military athlete because you're using, in an ideal world, different terrains, which of course is what their foot and ankle are going to have to get used to in the battlefield. Barbell complexes are still in there, and we're looking at more awkward loads such as, for example, a log clean or a front squat. As you can see, the reps have increased, so we're trying to hold on to strength, but we're dragging out the amount of the time duration over which that this is expressed. Circuit training, again, could have gone for any method in terms of improving aerobic power, but just looking to generate an intensity in that short duration, for example the 30 seconds, that is higher than what the duration otherwise would have been if we trained for an equivalent time, but we just had that one working interval. Options I like for this circuit, prowler push, again, just because we're developing that foot and ankle, and because it's going to be minimal delayed onset muscle soreness because there's no lowering phase. Sled drags, again, God forbid you have to drag someone through a battlefield. Chest to floor, get back up, so literally put your chest on the floor, stand back up. Again, just training the difference in levels that a military athlete might experience. And mountain climbers, just because doing as many of them as you can in, say, a 30-second time period is going to overload the heart and lungs. The TRX YTWs are just for a little bit of shoulder health. When you're involved in military personnel, you're probably going to be very used to doing things like pull-ups, but very used to doing things like push-ups, but not so used to doing posterior shoulder work, and an imbalance between the front and the back of the shoulder might be an increased risk of injury. Using something like a trap bar deadlift, this will allow us to use greater loads than the conventional deadlift we used in phase 1, but equally that range of motion difference might take off a little bit of the soreness. The push press compared to the overhead press means we're now using the legs to drive the weight upwards, and we're going to be able to overload that as well. The 5 times 5 minute max distance running allows us to build a little bit more aerobic capacity, if you will, but we can see how much we drop off in between intervals as a marker of our recoverability between those intensity efforts. So overall, we're looking to utilize movements which allow for the greatest overload. This is why we're using the trap bar deadlift and the push press as opposed to conventional deadlift and overhead press, where you typically lift lighter weight. Looking to introduce higher rep ranges, so going more towards that strength endurance or even that hypertrophy side of things. And as I said, more awkward loads, so such as the log clean, farmer's walk, and that's just allowing us to build strength in a slightly more specific way to military personnel or SAS. And finally, phase 3, now we're looking at specific stuff and we're still looking to build our aerobic power. So we've gone from bilateral work with 2 feet on the floor with our squats and deadlifts to now going into split squats. Again, a log push press is going to be a little bit more awkward, as is a Zercher squat, and you can see the reps have come up with this as well. On Monday, we're doing something called the Litvinov sprints. This is an idea again stolen from Dan John, but I think for military personnel it seems very appropriate. So what we're doing here is a heavy carry and or swing. So for example, put someone on your shoulders, carry them for a certain amount of distance, so for example 30 meters, put that load down, so whether that's a kettlebell or another person, sprint 30 meters, and jogging recovery in between reps, and 60 seconds between sets. So the reason why I like this is because if you're in the military, you'll probably have times where you have to sprint for your life and then you have to recover. And now we're looking at mixing modalities up. So what I mean by that is we won't just use running or swimming. For example, in this session I've designed 200 meter hard effort, 20 meter crawl, 50 meter Zercher carry. So now you're testing various elements in a combined session and seeing how well your body copes with those different movement patterns. Again, the sandbag is a lot more awkward to move than, say, another person. The circuit training, the time durations have gone up because you'll probably need more endurance as we get more towards the specific side of things. So what can strength and conditioning learn from the SAS and vice versa? So for me, watching the program Decisions Under Pressure, there was a brilliant part of the show where basically they had someone blindfolded, had them perform crawling exercises, sprinting, fatigued them physically, then took the blindfold off, and they wanted to see whether or not they could identify whether somebody looking at them was an ally or an enemy. Now, this is something I don't think we do enough of in strength and conditioning. Now, it doesn't have to be as crazy as this, but simply using games that involve decision making, stressing that perceptual cognitive cycle, seeing if athletes can dial in on the right cues at the right times whilst under fatigue. Another line from the show I loved was that one individual should be the whole team. And this, for me, I think there's reasons why elite sporting organisations are bringing in guys from the SAS to give team talks, because that sort of bonding between team members is going to be critical to any athletic endeavour that involves a team. Finally, emotional regulation. If you're involved in military, your hormonal system will be shot to pieces because you sleep very little, your adrenaline is probably constantly pumping, and in times where you can afford to relax, you need to let your body recover as best as it can. As I said, they're probably going to be highly sleep deprived, so they need to be able to switch it on when they need it and switch off when they don't. I think that's a skill that any sport can learn, especially sports that involve, for example, multiple day events, multiple matches in a short space of time, and even dealing with just the general emotion of sport and the highs and lows that come with it. So in summary, develop a physical quality first, then train to endure it. If you want to endure the repeated expression of force, i.e. strength endurance, you need to be strong in the first place. Secondly, you cannot cruise at a speed you don't have. What I mean by that is, if we look at the diagram on the bottom right, and I've explained this slightly in more detail in a video on conditioning for boxers, but the person on the left hand side does not have the aerobic capacity of the person on the right hand side. What this means is when the intensity of an event is at the level of the blue line, then the person on the left hand side is having to work at an unsustainable pace to try and keep up. What this means is that lactate is going to be produced, force production is going to be compromised, and the person on the left will tire much more quickly. And finally, sequence your training appropriately. Strength is the foundation to any other athletic quality. If you want to improve strength endurance, you need to be strong in the first place. If you want to improve running economy, being strong enough to handle your body weight certainly helps. And equally, if we're talking about military personnel, a strength reserve is always going to be useful. So let me give an example. If I have Comrade A, who has a maximum loaded carry of 150 kilos, and Comrade B, who has a maximum loaded carry of 80 kilos, if you weighed 70 kilos, which of those two people would you want hauling your 70 kilo ass off the battlefield? If you've got any sense about you, then you'd rather the person who is stronger, Comrade A. Otherwise, and when it comes to sequencing your training properly, if we don't do this, we're effectively putting the horse before the cart. We can't endure a quality that we don't have. So as I said, whether it's speed and hoping to develop speed endurance, we develop speed first. Strength, we look and develop strength endurance, we develop strength first. As I said, you cannot repeat a quality you don't have. Strength training is going to build robustness, it's going to make you more resilient, and it's going to underpin everything from your speed to your ability to be repeatedly explosive. Interestingly, strength training has also been shown to help athletes recover more quickly than athletes who are weak or have not strength trained. I hope you found this video useful. If you would like to support more of my content, then and you're in a position to do so, please subscribe to my Patreon channel. And if you have any feedback, any further requests, as I said, I'm looking to do more of these videos. Please do get in touch by your preferred method. Thank you for listening. I'm Todd from P2P Coaching.